Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your kind of deeper dives into a couple of the case studies. It is really a pleasure that I now get to kind of move us into the debate section of our time together. And having heard little previews and snippets of this, I'm really quite excited to get it going. But before we start, I wanted to just say, if you could all take out your phones, go to Slido, and we're going to do a quick poll just to kind of get your views on the topic behind me. We want to understand your views now and see how they shift or change or don't over the course of the debate. So please do get out your phones and fill out the poll. It's one question, so it shouldn't take too long. And then we'll go ahead and kick things off. So I'll pass it over to Charlie Coverman, who is the treasurer of the Oxford Union, who is going to chair the debate.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon. I hope you've all had very interesting days so far. And with only 90 minutes to go until the drinks reception, the end is very nearly in sight. So welcome to this Oxford Union-style debate. The motion before us this afternoon is this House believes that investors should only be concerned about financial returns. Each side, proposition, give us a wave, and opposition, have 3 speakers, and they'll be putting forward their arguments. During each speech, audience members will have the opportunity to put forward short sort of points to the person debating. So if you want to do that, please call out a point of information. It's up to the individual speakers whether they choose to accept this. They can equally decline and move on with their speech. After we've heard from Eileen, the second opposition speaker, there'll be an opportunity for audience members to make short speeches of sort of no more than 2 minutes in length. So please start sort of thinking about what you're going to add to this debate. Each speaker has 7 minutes to make their case, and when you hear the bell, which sort of goes like this, if I rung it, it'll sound a bit too much like a town crier. It gives them, that sort of gives them a 1-minute warning, and then once you hear it again, their time is up, and we'll have to sort of stop them from speaking. So with all of that I now look to Cassandra Sullivan, the Oxford Union's graduate officer, Lincoln College, to open the case for the proposition. Lineker.
It's okay. Welcome, everybody. And to help set the same stage so we understand what an Oxford Union-style debate is, I wanted to give a brief description. It is more than eloquently degrading each other for the next 30 minutes. We will be discussing an important topic. The prep team will be in support of today's topic, the opposition team against the topic. And you, as the audience members, get to lean back and observe. Try and forget any preconceived notions that you have about this topic today. Try and forget everything that you've talked about in today's forum. It shouldn't be that hard. It's the end of the day. And really, really listen to the arguments in the case and vote for whichever team you think is the most attractive. You think gives the most attractive arguments. I now have the honor of introducing the opposition team. Our first speaker is my friend Sundeep. He's obviously from Norway. He's sporting a new haircut that leaves him unrecognizable to most of us in the class. His background is law, and after the MBA, he'll be going to McKinsey, which shows he's very comfortable lying to people. He's also our first ever Oxford Union candidate who lost his election. Him and I did get to share the failure together and bonded over the friendship, which I do value deeply and hope I still have after this debate. Our second speaker is Eileen, who I unfortunately also have to introduce as Estelle. I'm sorry, I had to say it. She's from Canada and one of the friendliest and most social people that I have ever met. I think her true calling in life is to be a party planner. And after you hear how she thinks business works today, you'll agree that that's probably a good profession for her. She's here paying her dues for her years spent working at Keurig and polluting the environment with thousands of those little K-cups. Thank you for saying sorry to us today and voting on the opposition side, Eileen. Realistically, even though she's giving me the side eye now and will continue to give me the side eye for the rest of this debate, she's one of the most remarkable people I've met in the MBA. And our third speaker is JJ. He's from South Africa and describes everything as very hectic. His background is in accounting, But based on his side in today's debate, I guess he probably wasn't very good at that job. He's one of the most altruistic people that I've ever met, and he is a master of the spoken word. And as he's soothing you with his voice today, listen very carefully to what he says, because he doesn't actually really know what he's talking about. And one thing that all three of them have in common is that they've never actually worked full-time practicing what they're going to be preaching to you today. So please keep that in mind when they emphasize how easy it is to measure and report on non-financials. So, like my favorite responsible business leader, Taylor Swift, once said, "Where there once was mad love, there now will be bad blood." And we will let the debate begin. The topic we're discussing is that this House believes that investors should be primarily concerned with financial returns. I recognize that in this room today, that positions the proposition team as steak lovers at a vegan conference, but bear with me. I promise we can present arguments and logic and reason to help you understand and still feel good about voting for the proposition and understanding that we as a society do want to address the major problems. We'll help you feel better about voting for proposition with the following arguments. The first argument is that we've seen the best and most innovative outcomes occur when you let people focus on the job that they're best at. It's an investor's moral and often legal responsibility to maximize values for the people of the money that they're investing. And that's okay. That doesn't have to be a bad thing. Why? Well, businesses do need to make money. And because the role for collective action to do public good has a team on it. It's the government. And being an American, it takes a lot of guts for me to say I have confidence in our government's abilities to solve those problems today. But I'll still argue for that. An example of this is the Clean Air Act introduced in the 1960s. Before this act was introduced, we saw that factories not only knew very little about the impact and harm that they were doing and having, but they had the inability for one individual actor to make a change because they would have just been eaten up and kicked out of the market. So the government stepping in and providing regulation that leveled the playing field allowed all of them to transition and do better and rise above. These checks and balances are what make our system work. It protects democracy as well as the free market and allows us to progress. We also need to recognize that at times the action needed to take to solve some of these very serious societal problems is not best solved in a for-profit model. That's why the nonprofit industry exists. You can look to the example of Microsoft and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have their arm to raise these funds through Microsoft, and they have this arm to serve and do good through this nonprofit foundation. That's a sensible model, and it's okay for the systems to lean on each other and interact that way. It's okay for businesses to want to make more money and investors to focus on financial returns. And it's okay for that money to go towards taxes and be donated to nonprofits to solve these serious issues that we as society do need to address. Which leads me to my second argument. When you don't let people focus on what they do best, there can be dire consequences. Investors may corrupt a purpose-driven system due to their financial responsibilities. When they are still forced to give these financial reports, but then also have self-reported metrics such as ESGs, it allows for loopholes. It allows for things to be unclear about what good is. An example of this is Foxconn. They had a wonderful ESG report. They could tell you the story of the jobs that they provided and the standard of living that was increased through their self-reported impact. That's not what made them change their behavior. What made them change their behavior was the public outcry that came from media attention. It was consumers demanding a change that made them pivot. It wasn't their self-reported ESGs that incentivized that behavior. And that brings me to my final argument. Since doing good is good for business, financials are a good indicator. It's a measurement that we agree on. As we've talked about all day, it's really difficult to measure impact in a lot of different spaces. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but we should recognize the value that we have in understanding financial reports as an indicator of businesses doing the right thing. We're seeing right now that in order to make money, you need to care about the environment. You need to demonstrate a serious commitment. And that's why places like Exxon have the largest investment in renewable goods. And this is a response to what we, as an informed society, are demanding. With unprecedented access to information, the responsibility isn't falling on our investors. It falls on all of us. Investors are reacting to consumer behavior. They're not the ones going out there, even though they do help make the rich richer. They're able to make the rich richer because of what we spend our money on, where you put your dollar bills. So that's something that we all need to be responsible for and recognize that as the opposition team shares these issues that we need to face, what's the biggest change that you can make to change it? Don't put it on someone who won't have the best impact and could corrupt the system in trying to do so and solving it. Recognize it for yourself. I won't be taking it. Thanks, JJ. I won't be taking it. Come on, it was on my last line. So as you step back today and you're weighing which team had the most attractive arguments, it's important to recognize and weigh and understand for the proposition that we've seen some of the best outcomes come when these systems interact with each other. We don't put pressure where the pressure is not effective. We protect the free market and democracy. And we as consumers put more thought into where we spend our money, where we cast our votes, and invest our time. So with that, I think we can all just wrap up and go home. I'll turn the time over to the opposition team. Thank you.
I thank Cassandra for her remarks. I now look to Sundeep Singh, St Hilda's College, to open the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for being here today to listen to this debate. Unlike Cassandra, I'm not here to entertain you because this debate is important. It's important not because of the motion we're discussing today, because you'll find pieces of this motion discussed in academia, newspapers, and business forums around the world. No. This debate is important because of you guys and your presence here today. Because you guys, as investors and potential investors, hold the power to put your beliefs about this motion into actions. You, as investors, steer companies, and through them, capital and talent in the direction you see fit. You, as investors, incentivize businesses and behaviors that you prefer. And you, as investors, therefore also have a moral obligation to invest responsibly. That is why this debate is important, because you guys are in the room, and because you guys can act. You decide where capital flows, and with it, where talent, opportunities, and even the future flows. Although this debate is important, it is also quite simple. It's about two lenses, and which of these two lenses you choose to view your investment through. The first lens is a purely financial lens, where you only look at IRRs and percentage returns. The second lens is the impact lens, where you look at the dent your investments are making in the world. And the opposition's case here today is that you should choose the latter lens. And to convince you about that, we need to succeed in making three compelling arguments. That choosing the impact lens is good for you as investors, the companies you invest in, and the planet you live on. Now, before I go on to make the opposition's case, it is my pleasure to introduce the proposition team today. I like that that was a joke itself. First, we have the first proposition speaker, Cassandra, who just spoke. She's a Deloitte consultant who consulted large Fortune 500 companies and is the Oxford Union liaison here at SBS. For those of you who don't understand what that means, it means that posting Facebook updates about Oxford Union debates is the closest she'll ever come to debate at the Oxford Union. As you've all probably noticed, Cassandra is incredibly sharp. She's so sharp, in fact, that she was one of the very few Oxford MBAs to be featured in Poets and Quants earlier this year. She does, however, also sometimes say some not-so-sharp things, which her speech is a very good example of. She says to Poets and Quants, talking about her identity and the real hardships of life, and I quote, and please keep in mind, I did not make this up. This is real. She says, I am a self-identified Taylor Swift activist. I went through the expensive process of bringing my 2 cats from the US to the UK, which is something I feel Taylor Swift would respect. Being from Norway, where we give out the Peace Prize, I've never seen someone deserve it more. Second, we have Patrick. Patrick has an incredible story. He went from hardship, and I'm not talking about hardship involving importing your cats to the UK, real hardship, and then went on to make a successful career in the financial industry. I feel Patrick is someone we all can learn from. He's got a great determination and a great work ethic. I'm truly glad to be his friend. I'm truly glad that he's part of our MBA class. The only problem is that he is never actually in class. I mean, we're 10 minutes into this debate, and I'm surprised he's still here. And last but not least, we have the third proposition speaker, Natasha. Natasha is the kind of person you really wish to meet when you apply to Oxford. She has a background in science, and she went to Kenya to work with social impact, helping smallholder farmers and the clients like the UN figure out how to use insurance for good. I was going to make a joke on Natasha, had it not been for the fact that she's already created more social impact than many of us will in our careers. So please join me in applauding her for that. I'm also not making a joke on Natasha because her own team during the rehearsals described her as really, really scary. And I'm Norwegian, we don't take those kind of risks. Now, let me establish my case. My arguments today for you to choose the impact lens are 2. First, that choosing the impact lens gives you higher financial returns. And second, that it gives you less risk. Let's start with the first argument, that using the impact lens gives you better financial returns. Over 2,200 studies have been conducted over the past 40 years looking at the correlation between ESG factors and financial returns. Over 90% of them, and I repeat, 90% of them conclude with a positive relation or at least a neutral relation between ESG factors and financial outcomes. To add to this, the KLD 400 Social Index, which is an index comprising of companies with a strong sustainability focus, has outperformed the S&P 500 over the past 20 years. These are indisputable facts. Now the proposition will say that this is the same argument they're making. If sustainable investments are performing better and investors only care about financial returns, surely they will only pick sustainable investments. Except that it is not the same argument. There is a difference, ladies and gentlemen, between only caring about financial returns and actually picking good financial investments. And that difference is what the opposition is addressing here today, and that difference is the impact lens. This takes me to my second argument, which is that using the impact lens helps investors de-risk their investments. Let me give you an example. The example is a pharmaceutical company called Valeant. Valeant was loved by Wall Street investors until quite recently, and we're talking quite prominent investors like Pershing Square, Value Act, and even the Sequoia Fund. The Valeant model to increase shareholder profits was quite simple. You tweak the numbers and you don't create any value. What Valeant did to increase its profits, and by that its shareholders' profits, was to cut R&D costs, meaning that they stopped making new drugs. And then they drove up the prices of life-saving drugs to profit from helpless customers. And the investors loved it. The share price skyrocketed. And the company said in every single interview the 3 magic words that will get our proposition very excited. Our company's goal is shareholder profit maximization. But the investors, blended by increasing profits and skyrocketing share prices, forgot to ask the one question they should have asked Valiant. What kind of a pharmaceutical company does not develop new drugs? It is their one job. It is the one problem they're supposed to solve. And as a result, the Valiant share price is today 90% down than its peak. And investors have lost billions of dollars. And our point is that this is an example of how only focusing on money and financial returns blinds investors. Had the investors in Valiant used the impact lens, they would have seen much more clear the problems with the company and therefore also save their losses. ESG is a better way of gauging risk than traditional investment measures will ever be. ESG factors reduce investor risk by making business models more robust, by attracting new consumers, partnership, and employees that you would otherwise not attract. With an increasingly large part of the company valuation being based on intangible assets like brands, this is quite important. More than half of global consumers say that they look at whether a company is committed to social impact before buying its products. More than 80% of millennials around the world say the same when choosing where to work. And companies like Patagonia say that they no longer want to partner with companies that are unaligned with their values. For you as investors, this is quite important because it matters for the businesses you invest in. Now the proposition will make the argument that ESG is not measurable. Cassandra certainly mentioned it. And that it can't be implemented in every industry. It is so fluffy. Well, chance have it that I have $1 trillion arguing against it. Today is the Norwegian National Day. And it's probably most fitting that I'd use the Norwegian oil fund as an example. We don't brag about much in Norway, but our $1 trillion oil fund comes with certain bragging rights. Because it shows that the arguments the proposition is making today are outdated. Not only is the Norwegian oil fund divesting out of oil and coal, they've been in the forefront of proposing and requiring ESG requirements of their investments for years. ESG is becoming increasingly measurable with the emergence of ESG rating agencies and standard reporting requirements. Stock exchanges around the world, including the London Stock Exchange, are publishing ESG reporting guidelines. Also, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, with around $7 trillion in assets under management, write in their Sustainable Investing Report, and I quote, ESG can be implemented across most asset classes without giving up risk-adjusted returns. This means that we have $8 trillion arguing against the proposition today. And caring so much about money as they clearly do, they should take notice. The bottom line for all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is the following. There is a moral correction coming. And you need to decide whether you want to be the corrector or the corrected. And in making that choice, I urge you to vote for the opposition today. Thank you.
I thank Sundeep for his remarks, and I now look to Patrick Kreidi, Green Templeton College, to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you very much. So a lot of people from the MBATs already know that I'm a very big fan of hip-hop. But unfortunately, hip-hop got many things wrong. But Wu-Tang Clan did get one thing right when they said, and I quote, "Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, y'all." So Cash rules everything around me. I loosely want to base my theme on this accurate observation. The two major points that I want to cover today are: one, cash flow is the one constant to all businesses, and two, pure business has contributed more to society than any other type of organization. But before I get to my main points, I just want to address a couple of the arguments that my classmate and dear friend Sundeep made. Notice how Sundeep is really trying hard to convince you that investing in companies that track ESG will increase your profit. The only measure that I've heard so far is to measure success is profits. And I don't know if he realizes this, but that's in our entire thesis. My question now is Sundeep secretly on the proposition team? Now, let's just pretend for a second that he didn't make this fundamental mistake, and let's assume that ESG does lead to profit. But if you listen carefully to your analytics professor, you'd know that correlation is not causation. Now, let's go to my first point and examine that first point together. What's the one thing that all businesses have in common? Small, big, medium-sized, global. They all need cash flow to survive. Cash flow and profits are objective measures. Your assets are either greater than your liabilities or you're bankrupt. It's pure and simple. ESG, on the other hand, is highly subjective. It depends on the individuals, what the individuals define as good or acceptable. They are not universal truths. So the question is, who sets the standards? How do we know they're not biased? How do we know they're not incompetent, corrupt, or just plain stupid? What type of businesses are going to be concerned at what point do we start holding businesses accountable for ESG? Who do we hold accountable? Do we hold accountable coffee shops that generate a few $100,000 in revenue per year? Startups that are yet to be profitable? Financial leaders, mid-sized firms? Succeeding in business is already hard as it is. And 2/3 of businesses fail within the first 10 years. 2/3 of 60% of restaurants fail within the first 3. So are we to make it harder for people to make ends meet and to innovate? Where do we draw the line is the question. So profit is not only a universal truth, it's actually intrinsic to the performance and the survival of businesses. So what do we do if a company fails to meet ESG standards? Do we force it to go bankrupt? What if it employs 100,000 people? Do we fire everyone from the company even if it's generating profits? Or do we fine it? And if we do fine it, then it's all about profit. A company is just going to adjust the way that it does business the same way that it adjusts. Yeah, go ahead.
So we would argue that if a company is making profit but destroying the future of the planet, then yes, we would want to shut it down.
So you're gonna get rid of, let's say, 100,000 of jobs just because it's objectively doing something wrong, right? That's what you're saying? Okay, so let's say, okay. First of all, how do you evaluate that? How do you determine what's right and what's wrong? Who are you to judge at this level? So 100,000 jobs, so you can do this much harm. If you exceed that harm, we're going to shut you down. We're going to fire everybody, and they're all going to go home, right? That's what you're saying?
Can't respond.
Oh, okay, there's no response. It was just to try to throw me off my game, but it's fine. Now, where was I? All right. Okay, so a company basically, okay, so at what point basically does all of this just fall apart and become people arguing about what's right and what's wrong, right? Which brings me to my next point. Pure business has contributed more to society than any other type of organization. Investments and businesses seeking profit has moved almost 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 30 years. I'm going to give you another example. Alexander the Great literally conquered the world. And needless to say, he was quite rich. However, he did not have proper heating. He didn't have plumbing or electricity. Lord knows he didn't even have a smartphone to communicate with his wife while he was away on business in India. So someone from a lower class family in the UK today actually has higher standards of living thanks to businessmen seeking profit. So you want to do good? Fine. Then follow in Bill Gates' footsteps. Bill Gates founded and ran Microsoft as a for-profit company, just like Cassandra mentioned. His goal was to maximize profits, pure and simple. Now that he's extremely wealthy and he has all this power and all this money, he's making a change through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But when you really think about it, imagine a world without the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Just imagine that for a second. Now imagine a world without Microsoft. Okay, I think you guys get the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. I now look to Eileen Chen, Mansfield College, to continue the case for the opposition.
Hi everyone, my name is Eileen. I am atoning for my sins currently, as Cass mentioned, but just like my career changed by coming here to pursue social impact, I think that financial markets can change too. So first, Sundeep went through why looking at non-financial returns is good for business and good for investors. I'm here to show you how it's essential for people and planet, with two arguments. First, why us as investors? Second, why now? Then I'll leave you with what now? What does this actually look like? But first, for some rebuttals. So, Patrick, we come from the same neighborhood in Canada, and I know we're apologetic as Canadians, but sorry, not sorry for what I'm about to say. First, yeah, we can lose 100,000 jobs, but what about if literally the whole planet collapses, $2 trillion of impact from climate change happens, the whole financial market system collapses, and we as humans don't have water or air to breathe, and our babies can't survive? You pick. And then, Cass, you talked about how investors, their role is to maximize for the people that are investing in, and that collective action happens with the government. Well, I'll show you later on how collective action doesn't really happen with the government because, one, they care about one geography, two, they're controlled by corporations, three, which are controlled by investors later on. And lastly, profitability is table stakes. We're not saying only look at ESG. Profitability is the life and blood of a business. We think we still need it to survive. That makes, or else it wouldn't be a business. We're proposing that you add the social lens because that will actually enable you to have profitability in the long term while also benefiting the people and the planet. Which brings me into my first point. Why us? This debate is about investors, but why isn't it about the government or future generations or consumers, as Cass mentioned? The reason is power. The power rests with investors. So I want you to imagine right now an ocean. This ocean is society. There are a lot of huge ships called businesses. And you know who steers these ships? Investors. And how big are these ships? Well, 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are businesses. So you can't deny, therefore, you can't deny that investors have the power to shape these large ships. And these large ships decide where the future of our people and planet go. But how do businesses actually impact people and planet? First, people, yes?
Are you talking about what businesses do or what investors do? Can you further define what you mean by investors specifically?
So investors, through their decisions to remunerate their board, the CEO, to the fact that they can allocate capital where they want, and with the availability of information they have in analyzing these businesses, have that power to steer where businesses go. So we think it's an equation of investors to business and business to people and planet. But that part of investors to business is the key of what we're talking about. Which brings me to my argument. Businesses, as Patrick said, large and small, employ the majority of the world. But because of that, businesses have this huge decision on their power. For example, child labor. A decision that Nike makes here in HQ can have massive implications on livelihoods, geographies across the world. They also have supply chains that governments just can't reach. So these businesses have a large power in terms of people and how they are impacted. Then, in terms of planet, it's undeniable that human activity has caused climate change. And what is human activity? It's consumption, it's food, it's transportation. All of these are business sectors at the end of the day. So we have a power, I think I've answered enough of those. We have the obligation as businesses and as investors to assume our responsibility for people and planet. Now, why look at investors and not government? I have 4 points. First is that governments act on short-term election cycles. They're caring about getting reelected, not about the good of the whole planet. Second, they also look at their own country and not internationally, and climate change is very much a global issue. Third, they're slow to act. Just look around us and look at how fast Brexit is happening. And fourth, regulations, as the proposition might say, regulations can solve everything. Well, if you look at your home country, Cass and Natasha, $3.5 billion was spent on lobbying by US corporations in just the last year. And that was more than the $1.8 billion that was spent by the House in their budget and the $860 million that they had in the Senate combined. So clearly, corporations control a lot of the government. And now, another argument that you might hear outside this room is, why not our children? They care more about it. Gen Z's all kumbaya, but they can solve it for themselves. Well, I don't know if you've seen the streets around the world lately on every Friday, but children are taking to the streets to protest the fact that they need to defend for their future, and the decisions we need to make are now by us. And then, why not citizens? Great movements happen all the time. That's how society has changed. And like you say, citizens can protest things from companies. But have you tried organizing and creating movement? You can't, as a marketer, I can tell you, you can't architect virality. It happens, you can't create it, and you can't science your way into it. This power is distributed. It is powerful, but given the fact that we need change right now, we need to talk to the people who have the most concentration of power, and that's investors. To recap, if you look around this room, think about all the power that's controlled here, and that all the responsibility that comes with it. Now my second argument, why now? You've heard stats all over the news. We have 12 years left before reversible climate change. 60% of wildlife has been erased since 1970. And one of my favorite / most depressing stats is that there was a seed bank for just in case humanity collapsed. And that was buried deep in Norway's permafrost less than 10 years ago. And last winter, that melted. So the time of crisis is now. And what do we do with that, though? Maybe we can just, sit on our laurels and be like, the world is doomed. But think about the last 100 years since 1919 and how much has changed. We've gotten out of 2 world wars. We've gotten out of slavery. We've given women's rights to vote. We've invented the internet, which now controls our daily lives. Humans are able to change our own future. We change all the time in one lifetime. And money itself is also a social contract that we believe could be changed. So 3 things to end. What could we possibly do? The proposition team makes you think that this is really hard, but there's 3 things you can do on Monday when you get to the office. 1, you can divest from things that are clearly bad, like oil and gas and coal. Second, you can hold your boards accountable to purpose metrics that do exist. Lastly, when you're choosing new investments, discern the better ones from the worst ones. With that, it is you, the investors, who have the power, and the time is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Before we hear from Natasha and JJ, we have time to hear some comments from the floor. So if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand. Reminder, speeches should last no more... Right, okay. Speeches should last no more than 2 minutes, and wait for the mic to get to you. So does anyone want to speak in proposition, sorry? Yeah, gentleman over here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Balkrishna. I'm an MBA here. As everyone knows, I'm slightly to the right of the Koch brothers. As I'd like to address the point that Eileen made. Is this thing on? That Eileen made a bit earlier about all those children going out on Friday afternoons and protesting. I used to be one of those children back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And what changed? Why am I this evil capitalist bastard right now? I grew up and I got a job. Specifically, I got a job as an investment banker, and there I was sitting working on an M&A deal involving a palm oil producer in my home country. And I'm thinking, how much impact is this thing actually having? Jobs were being created, roads were being built, People were going to school, people were getting jobs in parts of Indonesia that were incredibly impoverished. And I was thinking, just by doing this, I'm actually having a lot more impact than all those people digging wells in deepest, darkest Africa. And I'm actually making a pretty good living out of it as well. So now the thing is, right, should investors only be concerned about financial returns? Let's assume I'm an investor, right? Let's assume I'm running a hedge fund. If I decide that financial returns are the way forward, the only thing I should be looking at, if I do a reasonable analysis of the situation and think that profit's what I should be looking at, are you suggesting that I shouldn't be allowed to do that? That I should somehow be forced to look at ESG? And furthermore, you talk about moral obligations. People have different morals. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believes that it's immoral for billionaires to exist. I am nowhere near a billionaire, but I have no problem with Jeff Bezos being worth far more than me, although he will be worth a lot less after that divorce. But that's the thing. Who decides what's moral and what's not moral? Who appoints you God?
I thank the speaker for their remarks, and I'm being told we have time for one more. So does anyone want to speak in opposition of the motion and agrees with this side? Please raise your hands. Do you have any? Yeah, I recognize the speaker up there.
Okay. Hey, everybody, I'm Christian. So I would like to interrogate and deflate the idea that cash is what is objective and all the other measures are not. And so when I was an undergrad, I studied the philosophy of mathematics, and I wrote my thesis on whether or not math was created or discovered. And all I'm going to say is that, well, in summary, that basically math is a constructed discipline that we agreed on. It's all based off of 11 unproven axioms that everything is based off of. It's not this hard, fast idea that really started way back in the day in a Socratic dialogue called Plato's the Meno, where he was saying that, and I understand this is theoretical, but give me the benefit of the doubt for just a second. Socrates was getting in a lot of trouble for corrupting the youth, and his argument was that, listen, I'm not a teacher. All of these things are already known. People are just discovering them. I'm not the one that is corrupting them. And he goes through this basically thought experiment where a person discovers that in order to double the area of a square, they had to figure out what the length of the diagonal was and multiply that by itself in order to, I guess, double the area of the square. I say that to say that math is not just this discovered thing that has these hard, fast truths that nothing can be argued with. Because if you think about it, if I were to ask you what the definition of two was, you'd be like, I don't know, like two things. But those are two fingers, that's not two. It's, you know, if you think about what the definition of two is, you would say, well, it's the set that contains nothing and the set that contains nothing. Or it's the set that contains the set that contains nothing. Therefore, this idea that cash is objective is not true. It's intersubjective at best. And therefore, you know, if we can come to an agreement about what these measures are in terms of numbers, we can also do the same thing with ESG. It's not hard, fast. It's plausible.
I thank both speakers for their contributions, and I now look to Natasha Naidoo, St. Catherine's College, to close the case for the proposition.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Christian. Great question. Yeah, fiat money. I think we all agree that that's real. Yeah. All right, so let's remember what we're here for and what we're looking at, and that's investors, right? And so let's keep in mind, investors are morally and legally obligated to the people whose money they are investing, and they are highly incentivized to make returns. The optimism of the opposition is based on a case of universal self-sacrifice, which moves from optimism to pure naivete. And so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes rebutting Eileen's points, and then stepping back and looking at what we're weighing today and what those worlds look like. So her first point is why us? And she talked about a moral obligation, and that is a great argument. All of us in here do have a lot of power, but you don't exercise that power by forcing investors to haphazardly evaluate their investments. You change the way that consumers behave and make that profitable for investors to invest in. And your role as a business person and as a consumer is to champion that change. Then she scared us with the ticking time bomb of 12 years to extinction, with no real way to save ourselves. Instead, she just condemned government as too short-sighted to make change. But let me remind you about the Clean Air Act that Cassandra brought up and just fill in a few more details. So LBJ in 1963 with a single stroke of his pen, put the Clean Air Act into law. And what this meant is, yes, it was expensive. It did cost $523 billion for all of the polluting companies to comply with the regulations in that act. However, in return, what we had was over 200,000 premature deaths averted. We had over a 10% decrease in pollution worldwide as a result of this act. So yes, when laws happen, they do affect everyone. It's not just the United States. And lastly, we saved over $500 trillion in that act. Yeah, take that in. That's a lot of money. That's over 95 times return on your investment. And so that is something that government can do very easily. And so in the world where the average investor only stays with a stock for less than a minute, and long-term investors, on average, only hold their stock for 3 years, a 4-year election cycle feels an awfully lot longer than an investment cycle and an investment commitment. And as we've shown, it can be quite a bit more powerful. Then the opposition calls for divesting from companies. And this is really, really problematic. It's not just neutrally bad, as like the companies could exist, but it's actually actively harmful. And so let me give you an example. So we just use our gut to say a company is bad, right? What is this moral obligation? Like, I don't know if a company is bad. I'm probably going to read in the news and say, oh, this company is getting some bad press. So let's use one of those. Let's use Monsanto for an example. We might feel, if all of us in this room and all of you watching at home were to pull our money from Monsanto and divest, we would feel really good about ourselves. We'd be like, yeah, we're punishing that bad company for having bad policy. I read it in the New York Times. It's real bad. But in reality, we would be hurting smallholder farmers in Malawi and Zambia, where Monsanto runs the single largest insurance program in those countries, supporting smallholder farmers and protecting them from drought. We would be hurting researchers who are designing new seeds that can withstand the undeniable effects of climate change. And we'd be condemning billions to starvation because they don't have access to hybrid seeds. And those people are not in this room. They don't have the consequence and the voice that we do. But when we decide, because it makes us feel good, or the opposition says something glib like, just divest from bad companies, it's easier said than done. And without adequate universal standards, it's just something that makes us feel good without having to suffer the real world consequences. Their second point is have people be, hold boards accountable for purpose metrics, even if it's hard. Activist investors meet with boards. They're concerned with just profit, and will continue until the incentives are changed, which the opposition does not put forward as a position. So don't let JJ come up here and say, oh, no, we're going to change incentives. It's totally going to be fine. However, we do, right? We activate stronger government controls and putting those standards and regulations into place so that can actually be changed. And then their third point is be discerning when making investments. ESGs, when companies make them, reporting is very arbitrary, as Cassandra said. At best, arbitrary. At worst, it's a great revenue for the big four to say, oh, yeah, you're doing great on your ESGs. It's just an extra thing we can say. However, when investors focus on financial returns, these impacts are already baked in. So when you buy Unilever stock, you're taking their commitment to decouple growth from environmental impact into that stock price. So that makes it okay, for you as investors to focus on the financial return, because purpose metrics are already baked in. So let's step back and look at the worlds we've presented in this debate. If you want to vote for the most attractive team, then that's by far the opposition. Definitely vote for them. But if you want to vote for the most attractive arguments, you're going to have to vote for us, and here are 3 reasons why. So 1, if you believe that impact is important, but without clear standards, the knock-on effects are infinitely regressive, trying to decide, okay, if I invest in this brewery, do I get more alcoholics? What about obesity? Like, yeah, maybe it's building community, but what does that actually mean? Then you're going to vote for us, because we're the only side that has a plan for putting those metrics into place to actually do comparison. And you seem like the kind of crowd that actually trusts facts over feelings. But even if you don't believe the standard metrics are important, you should still vote for us, because in the world of the opposition, the world of divestment and gut feelings actively hurts people. Think of those smallholder farmers in Malawi whose livelihood depends on this insurance product. Okay. Finally, if you're someone who is itching for change, we are the team that you vote for. By allowing investors to focus on financial returns, it frees up business people like yourselves to implement models like the economics of mutuality and to show success on the balance sheet. Today we had incredible speakers at an incredible conference, and I advocate for all of you to take those practices and put them into work and have those tough conversations at your place of business. Because investors, they can suggest that you do things, but ultimately, as leaders in your own companies, you're the ones who decide whether or not those things happen in practice. So for that, please pick out your phones and vote for the proposition. Vote for standards that stick, vote here in this room, and vote in your home countries, because that's where the actual change is going to happen. Thank you.
I thank Natasha for her remarks, and I now look to JJ, Pembroke College, to wrap up this debate.
Hectic. Right, so this is the last debating speech between yourselves and the wine. I'll have you know it's organic, sustainably sourced, and was transported here on electric scooters. You can thank us later. And my job today is to take you through the debate and explain to you exactly in which ways proposition failed and the debate falls to the side of the house. There will be insight, there will be tree hugging, and it may even get emotional. But first, 3 points of rebuttal. So we heard from the floor from Bala, particularly this question around morality, like who made us gods, and why do we get to decide what's important and what's not? And we feel that this isn't a question of morality, this is a question of rationality, i.e., if you're facing the collective extinction of the entire planet, it would be irrational to continue acting in the way that we are. We don't feel this is a question of relative right or wrongness. No, thank you. But plain logical sense. Second point, we heard about capitalism and how it's lifted billions of people out of poverty, for which we are deeply, deeply grateful. But the nature of the problem has changed. The nature of the problem is no longer poverty. We have enough money, we have enough food, we have enough housing. The nature of the problem now is how do we sustain the levels of wealth that we've created without destroying the ecosystem that allowed us to create it. And for this, we need to reconfigure capitalism. And our third point, I find it quite ironic that the main point of legislation that they brought to the House today was the Clean Air Act, right? And that in the next 11 years, the issue that we're dealing with is global emissions and sort of the dirtying of the act. Clearly, if legislation was as effective as they would lead us to believe, we wouldn't be facing an international crisis that has to be solved in the next 11 years. And surely we need to be asking more of investors than to just sit back, don't worry, government will do something about it. Right, but now I want to dive into some context before I get into the analysis of the debate today. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, as Sundeep said, 2 sets of lenses. A financial lens or an impact lens. What this would mean for an investor, whether individual, institutional, pension fund, is that if you have a whole lot of investments in front of you, and assuming they all bring some return, right? This isn't charity, this is a return above zero. What we would have you do is not put on the financial lens and decide we're going to choose the one with the highest return on investment. We would have you put on an impact lens and decide what does the world need in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, in terms of impact to people and impact to planet, and pick those companies. No, thank you. They would have you believe that outside of the house would shut down all businesses tomorrow. This is not what we're saying, ladies and gentlemen. We think companies that produce food do address a need in 10, 20, 50 years' time, and they would continue to survive. But we feel like companies that are pumping emissions into the air, lobbying to keep electric cars and transformation to renewables underground. These are bad companies for the future of the planet, and those ones would fail to survive. We call that evolution. No, thank you. So this debate really came down to three main issues, three main fault lines that we feel all fall to our side of the house. The first one is where we're going collectively. The second one is why investors? Why is it our responsibility to handle? And the third one is, how will we get there? So on the first point, where are we going? We would argue that opposition is the only side of the house with their eyes open. And if I may build on, oh no, I don't have my wallet here. If I may build on Christian's philosophical adventure, when you take out a piece of money and you look at this piece of paper with a picture of the Queen on it, like, what is that? Is that reality? Is that more real than your children and the relationships that you have with your children and the future of your children? Is that more real than the clean air you breathe and the food you're able to eat because the weather hasn't disrupted our ability to grow food? Than the oceans that aren't yet acidified? Is that more real than all of those things? Are you going to eat money? Are you going to use money to keep you cool post-2030? What we would argue is that opposition is interested in the reality of the world around us, and we're not just going to wait for the invisible hand to pull us out of this mess. Finance is a story, and when you face 11 years into environmental calamity and a world that is becoming disillusioned with the inequality, with the financial narrative that the status quo perpetuates, we beg to oppose. Second point. Why investors? I guess the two sort of sides that we heard from, or the two arguments we heard from proposition is, one, this is not really the role of business. This is not really the role of investors. It's the role of government. It's the role of consumers. They can lobby. They can apply pressure. And the other thing that is often raised is that, well, business assumes too much. We mustn't paint business as these heroes of the world. They must know their place. And what we would argue is a simple analogy. So if you imagine that we're all on a bus with the entire population of the world on that bus as passengers. Perhaps government was driving at one point in time, but for argument's sake, that's seized up, right? The moment when you have 69 of the 100 biggest economies in the world represented by multinationals, you cannot argue that government is in the driver's seat. So if investors shape the role that business plays, and if business is having all the impact that Eileen espoused upon, how can we, sitting in the driver's seat, heading towards a cliff, pretend that we have no responsibility to the passengers on this bus? How can we not steer clear of disaster? And our third point, how will we get there, right? So we heard, ESG is really hard. It's really hard. It's so fluffy. It's so subjective, right? Accounting standards were also really hard until they converged and they took what was subjective into objective, measurable reality. These things improve with time, and this is the process we're seeing at the moment. But more than that, until that time, we can use common sense and decide, well, like, what is the world going to need in 50 years? Do we need another app? Do we need, more coal, more travel? Probably not. So, to close, once you've seen, it's very difficult to unsee the impact that we have as investors, the impact that we have upon the earth, and what the world needs right now from all of us. I'd like to end with a poem. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake. My great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the world was plundered? What did you do when the planet was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, fish were all dying. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do once you knew? We cannot continue to wear financial lenses, ladies and gentlemen.
I thank JJ for his remarks, and in fact, can we hear it for all 6 speakers? I thought they did a fantastic job.